Back to our man Sam for a moment then. This is the kind of fun question for us, I guess. So what sort of companies would make good investments for the developed world's ageing population? I guess he carries on in a moment, but I guess what he's meaning is given that the developed world has an ageing population rather than what should old people buy. Obviously, as healthcare, he says he thought about funeral care, but doesn't think that there are many public companies in that sector, mostly small businesses. Steve, what do you think old people like?
Well, I think that's a really tricky kind of thing to answer. I guess if we were thinking in terms, you'd be thinking Vici might be a good one because of casinos and gambling. It kind of is an attraction of older people. I guess we would have to look at something like Welltower, which is probably one of the biggest care providers in the US. That's a pretty interesting company. But outside of that, I've read in 2 books recently because I have just finished my 25 books for the year, and I've read in 2 of them now that they think that the first person to get to 1,000 years old has already been born, and they're not talking about it in ways that you're just going to be able to pop a pill and that will extend your life. They're talking about basically the way that we can now, or at least in some degree, reprogram genetic code and grow things that we were never previously able to grow, even down to growing skin, which is something strange I read in one of the books the other day. Apparently, when they use cadaver skin, I'd never sort of truly understood where that came from. I assumed some poor fellow had fallen off a motorbike and they were currently harvesting him in another room. But actually, that's all been grown from a single person who donated her body to medical science, and they've been keeping her skin alive for like 60 years or something like that, which is a gruesome but also interesting fact. But yeah, so they think that essentially when body parts and organs will get worn out, there will be a price that you can pay to have them grown in a laboratory and put back into you, which will obviously extend your life quite considerably, especially if you've got something like kidney failure in your 40s. That would almost definitely solve that problem with minimum rejection. So I guess the question really is what kind of future do you see? Do you see that future that I'm talking about, or do you see the future looking like the sort of future I described where you just pop down to Las Vegas every so often and you spend all your time in a care home? And that's a really tricky question to answer, I think. Steve, do you have any insight on that?
I initially sort of started off thinking about this. I have a couple of thoughts coming up, but I sort of set myself up to think, well, okay, what does a kind of ageing population appreciate? And I thought, well, they like overcooked vegetables, so I wondered who owned Harvester and whether you could buy shares in them. And they like eating dinner at sort of 5 o'clock in the evening, so I thought, what can we do about that? And I didn't really come up with much of an investment idea. And I thought maybe you should buy shares in ITV because they all like Coronation Street and Emmerdale. And then I realised this was a fairly sort of futile exercise on my part, so I went off to do some more serious kind of research about these things. And I found this thing I remembered seeing once on Free Trade sort of many, many years ago called the Ishares Aging Population ETF. See, someone will do this job for you. And its investment objective says the fund seeks to track the performance of an index composed of developed and emerging market companies. So actually, this is not just, to Sam's question, the developed world's ageing population, but also emerging too. But we might find some things here that cover both, which are generating significant revenues from the growing needs of the world's ageing population defined as people aged 60 years and above. Okay. So I had a look down this with Steve last week, actually, and I was going to get Paul to have a guess at this, but he's not here, and probably no bad thing, because I suspect he would have been here until next week's podcast if I let him have a go at this. But predictably, the first 4 things here are Biotechs, which is not a massive surprise, interested in treating the kind of diseases and conditions that people get as a result of living longer, or are more susceptible to as a result of living longer. Fairly predictable stuff there. Then the 5th biggest thing on the list is not a biotech anymore. The ones below it on this first page all are. But I'll give you a chance, listener, to have a quick guess at what you think the 5th thing on the list might be. That would be relevant to old people, specifically people over the age of 60. Steve had a couple of guesses. They're pretty good guesses. They're both wrong. You're also wrong, dear listener. It is, in fact, Robin Hood. That is apparently somehow relevant to the needs of the ageing population. What they want is to have their order flow sold for cash to Goldman Sachs.
That's absolutely mental, isn't it? I actually had forgotten what the answer was, and I'm equally shocked by it the second time. It's absolutely bonkers. Like, where the hell? Who buys that? Is Robin Hood in charge of this ETF?
Almost certainly not. It's BlackRock, I think, is in charge of this ETF one way or
Sell
another.
BlackRock.
I saw some other fun things that are apparently relevant to old people at the moment. One is Polaris, so old people like power sports. Apparently that strikes me as unlikely. I actually thought cruises might do better, but they don't appear on this list anywhere. Tractor supply company for when you want a tractor in your retirement and so on for tractoring things. But anyway, actually, I think I heard they don't supply tractors, which is sort of weird for that name.
Hardware store, isn't it?
Something like that. But yep, that also features on this list. Unsurprisingly, this list is actually quite a well-diversified ETF, for what it's worth. 40-odd positions or so, just based around that kind of theme of, well, I suppose fairly tenuous in some cases connection to the needs of the over 60s. But there's a decent amount of real estate and there's a decent amount of biotech in there. Welltower doesn't feature in there for some reason. I can't quite figure out. That struck me as the obvious thing too. But in general, real estate, I thought, struck me as a positive kind of trend there. If you think people are living longer, you presumably think that population is growing. As we kind of increase people at the lower end of the age and don't lose them from the top end. That, I think, puts pressure on space. So I would have been looking, if I was thinking in the developed world in America, at something that owns a load of coastal real estate, one way or another. Camden Property is one in the Sunbelt. That's quite a niche sort of idea that I've got going on there, but I would be thinking about those sorts of things. The ones on here are Medical Properties Trust and Global Medical REIT and some other things that are sort of similar to that. This ETF owns quite a lot of cash, actually, for what it's worth.
Yeah, that's so did the older generation. What about Manchester United? Does that make the cut, Steve? I'm just thinking there'll be no young people looking to come along and replace the ageing population who support Manchester United at the moment.
No, that's another thing, of course, that Elon Musk is attempting to not buy. And unlike, I'm also attempting to not buy it, but, unlike him, no one's pursuing me through the court to go and buy Twitter. But yeah, no one wants Manchester United, including these things. They're too busy with their power sports RVs from Polaris. So yeah, real estate and medical stuff, I guess, is what I would think of as relevant here. I wonder whether sort of hardware tractory stuff is to do with increasing need for food or something along those lines. So think population growth, I suppose, is our fairly impressionistic approach to these sorts of things. Enough to do with macro trends that we don't understand. Thanks for the question anyway, Sam. Do write us another one. I enjoyed thinking about this very much, even if I had nothing of any use to say at all from an investment perspective. Roughly the story of how I approach this podcast, which, is slightly different to Paul, who thinks about it very little and then has nothing to say of any substance.